My daughter said she was pregnant. Then I saw the father, and I couldn't speak. Not a single word, not even a breath. I just stood there in my own living room, holding a glass of lemonade that slipped right out of my hand and shattered on the floor, and I didn't even look down because I was staring at a dead man. If you're listening to this right now, I need you to stay with me because what I'm about to tell you is not the kind of story you think you know. This isn't just about a secret coming back to life. This is about a lie so deep, so perfectly buried that it grew roots under my feet for 10 years without me even feeling the ground shift. And by the time I felt it, the earth had already opened up and swallowed everything I thought was real. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from right now. Are you in your car, your kitchen, lying in bed at 2 a.m. with your headphones in? I read every single comment, every one, because stories like this, they don't belong to just one person. They belong to all of us who have ever looked at our life and thought, I built this. I built this with my own hands, and then watched it burn. So let me take you back. Let me take you all the way back to where this story really begins. Not the day my daughter walked through that door with her announcement, but the night, 10 years ago, when I stood at the edge of a fire and watched the man I once loved disappear into the smoke. His name was Daniel. Daniel Mercer, and when I say he was handsome, I don't mean in a simple, obvious way. I mean the kind of handsome that makes you lower your guard before you even realized you had one. He had this way of walking into a room and making every person in it feel like they were the only one he'd come to see. That was his gift. That was also, as I would later understand, his weapon. We got married young. I was 24, he was 31. My mother said the age gap worried her. My best friend Sandra said something felt off about him, but she couldn't explain what. I didn't listen. Love has a very particular kind of deafness. It filters out everything that doesn't match the song already playing in your head. For the first 2 years, the marriage was fine. Not magical, not the fairy tale I'd painted in my mind, but fine. We had a house, we had routines, we had Sunday morning coffee and occasional laughter, and the quiet humming normalcy that most people call a good life. What we didn't have was honesty. I know that now, but back then I thought what we had was peace. Then I found the account. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that because for a long time I felt guilty, like finding it was somehow my fault. I was looking for our tax documents. We kept them in a shared folder on the computer, and I accidentally opened the wrong file. And there it was, a bank account I had never seen, in Daniel's name, with deposits that did not match any income I knew about. Transfers from accounts I didn't recognize, numbers that made my stomach drop. I didn't confront him that night. I'm not sure why. Fear, maybe? Or that specific kind of paralysis that comes when you realize the ground beneath you might not be solid, and you're too scared to jump and find out. So I waited. I started quietly looking, and the more I looked, the worse it got. He wasn't just hiding money. He was hiding a whole other financial life. Investments, withdrawals, a pattern that when I finally showed it to my brother who works in finance, he looked at me with very careful eyes and said, "Vivian, this looks like someone who was planning to leave." Planning to leave. I confronted Daniel on a Thursday night in October. I remember because it was cold, the first real cold snap of the season, and the windows were fogging up from the heat inside. I laid everything out on the kitchen table, the printouts, the numbers, the dates. I asked him to explain, and he did something I will never forget. He smiled. Not a guilty smile, not a caught smile, a calm, patient smile, like I was a child who had found a wrapped gift before Christmas and didn't understand what I was looking at. He said, "You're overreacting, Viv." He said there were explanations. He'd walk me through everything in the morning when I was less emotional. I told him I wanted answers now. He went to bed. 3 weeks later, there was a fire at the warehouse he co-owned with his business partner. It started late at night when no one was supposed to be there, but Daniel's car was found in the parking lot, his wallet, his phone, and remains, partial but enough that the medical examiner confirmed as consistent with his body. The official report said accidental fire, faulty electrical wiring, a tragedy. I buried him, or I buried what they told me was him. I stood at a grave in the November rain with my daughter Lily on my hip. She was only 4 years old, and I cried. Not just for him, for all of it. For the marriage that had never quite been real, for the answers I never got, for the version of my life I thought I was living. And then I closed that chapter. I sealed it shut. I raised my daughter alone. I built a business. I built a life. I told Lily her father was a complicated man who was gone too soon, and I left it at that. For 10 years. 10 years. And then my daughter came home and said she had someone she wanted me to meet. Act 2. The announcement. 9 to 18:30. Lily was 22 when she came home that Sunday. She'd been living in the city, working at a design studio, doing exactly the kind of creative work she'd talked about since she was 7 years old. I was proud of her, fiercely, almost achingly proud. She had grown into this sharp, beautiful, quietly confident young woman, and every time I looked at her, I felt both full and terrified, the way I think only mothers understand. She called me the Friday before to say she was coming home Sunday and that she had big news. My mind went immediately to the studio. Maybe a promotion. Maybe she was moving abroad for a project. I made her favorite meal. I tidied the house. I was ready for good news. She arrived around noon. She came in glowing, and I mean that literally, the way some people carry light differently depending on what's happening inside them. She hugged me tight, sat down at the kitchen table, took both my hands in hers, and said, "Mom, I'm pregnant." I felt everything at once, joy and shock and the instinctive animal protectiveness that never leaves you when you're a mother. I asked if she was okay. I asked how far along. I asked about the father. And she smiled this enormous, lit-up smile and said, "That's the other part of the news, Mom. He's here. I want you to meet him. He's outside." And I thought, how sweet. She brought him. She wanted my blessing. She wanted to do this properly. I stood up. I walked toward the front door. She was behind me, and she said, "Mom, meet the father of my baby." I opened the door, and the lemonade glass fell out of my hand, because standing on my porch, taller, slightly grayer, with new lines around his eyes, but the same jaw, the same posture, the same unbearable smile, was Daniel, my dead husband, Lily's father. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, very calmly, like this was a perfectly reasonable Tuesday, "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey." I could not speak. I am a woman who has run a business for a decade. I have negotiated contracts, managed crises, sat across tables from people who wanted to take things from me and come out with everything intact. I have never, not once in my adult life, been rendered completely speechless. I was speechless. My daughter stepped forward and slipped her hand into his arm. She leaned into him, and she looked at me with eyes I almost didn't recognize. Not the warm, open eyes of the girl I raised. something colder, something that had been decided a long time ago. She said, "He told me what you really did the night of the accident, Mom." Act 3. The truth begins to surface. 1730 to 2500. I made them come inside. I don't know how I functioned. Muscle memory, maybe. The body doing what the mind cannot. I sat across the table from a man I had mourned, a man whose name I had spoken at a graveside, a man whose death had quietly shaped everything about the last 10 years of my life. How cautious I became, how self-reliant, how careful about who I let close. And here he was, breathing, older, sitting in my kitchen like he had simply stepped out to run an errand and come back. I said, "You faked your death." He didn't deny it.
He said he'd been in trouble. The business partner, I won't say his name, had found out about money Daniel had misappropriated from their shared accounts, not just hidden from me, stolen from the business. He said he didn't have a choice. He said the plan was always to disappear, sort things out, and this is where I almost laughed because the alternative was to scream. He said the plan had been to eventually come back for Lily. Not for me, for Lily. I asked him how he found her. He looked at me steadily and said, "I never stopped watching, Viv. I knew where you were. I knew where she went to school. I waited until she was old enough." He waited until she was old enough. This man, this ghost, had been watching my daughter grow up from a distance, and at some point in the last year, he had decided to step back into her world, not as a stranger, not carefully or gently or with any kind of appropriate caution. He had walked into her world, told her he was her father, told her God knows what version of our story, and I still can barely say this, he had started a relationship with her. Not a father-daughter relationship, a romantic one. He and Lily were not, let me be absolutely clear because I know how you're reading this, they did not know each other as father and daughter first. He had approached her under a different name, a different identity. They had been together for 8 months before he revealed who he really was, and by then, she was pregnant. And by then, he had already told her his version of the night of the fire. His version. I looked at my daughter and I said, "Lily, what did he tell you?" She said, "He told me you knew about the fire before it happened. He told me you found out he was leaving you and you called someone. He said the fire wasn't an accident." The room went very still. Because here is what I need to tell you now, and I need you to hear all of it, every word. The night of the fire, I had called Marcus. I had called my brother Marcus because I was scared, because I had found not just hidden accounts, but evidence that Daniel had been involved with people I did not understand, people Marcus had quietly warned me about once, years earlier, without explaining why. I called Marcus that night after Daniel went to bed and I said, "I think something bad is going to happen." Marcus told me to take Lily and stay at his house. We left at midnight. The fire happened at 2 a.m. I never touched that fire. I never arranged anything. I left because I was afraid of my own husband. And somehow, in the story Daniel had spent years constructing, the story he fed my daughter like medicine dissolved in something sweet, I had become the villain. I had become the woman who orchestrated his death, the woman who had stolen Lily from her father, the woman who deserved to have her world pulled apart at the seams. He had spent 10 years building a case against me, and he had used my own child to deliver the verdict. I want to tell you that I handled the next hour with grace and composure. I didn't.
I cried, I argued, I begged my daughter to listen to me, and watching her sit there, slightly leaned toward him, her hand resting on her stomach, looking at me like I was a stranger, that was the most painful thing I have ever experienced, worse than the fire, worse than the burial, because this was Lily. This was the person I had built my entire life around. But I also stopped. Mid-sentence, I just stopped because I realized something in that moment. He had planned this, every single beat of it. His reappearance, the pregnancy, bringing her here, the way she said those words, he told me what you really did, with the exact cadence and timing of someone who had rehearsed. He had coached her. He had positioned himself perfectly. And if I fell apart, if I screamed, if I dissolved, if I made this into the chaos he was clearly expecting, I would look exactly like the woman he had described to her. So I breathed. I looked at my daughter and I said, I love you, and I am going to prove everything to you, but I need you to be safe while I do. Then I looked at Daniel and I said, nothing, because there was nothing left to say to him that wasn't better said in another room with other people present. I called Marcus that night. He drove 4 hours.
I called my attorney the next morning. And then I started to pull on the threads, because a lie that big, held together for that long, never unravels cleanly. But it does unravel. The death record, the remains that had been confirmed as his body. Marcus knew people, and I don't mean that in any dark way. I mean he knew professionals, forensic professionals, people who asked the right questions in the right places. And what they found, slowly, carefully, over the following weeks, was a picture of an elaborate fraud. Dental records that didn't quite match, a business partner who had, it turned out, quietly moved out of the country 6 months before the fire, a paper trail that suggested the fire had been planned, just not by me, by Daniel. He had faked his death to escape both his business debts and me. He had used someone else's remains, we may never know whose, and he had disappeared into a new identity with money he'd been siphoning for years. He had a whole other life in another state, other accounts, other people. And then, whether out of obsession or cruelty or some twisted version of what he called love, he came back to burn it down again. I'm not going to wrap this up in a bow. Life doesn't do that, and I think you deserve the real ending, not the clean one. Daniel was arrested. The fraud charges alone were significant: identity fraud, falsifying death records, financial crimes that stretched across 2 states. There are still proceedings ongoing, and I won't say more than that because my attorney would like me not to. But he is not free, and he is not in my daughter's life. Lily is the complicated part. She is still my daughter. She is having a baby, my grandchild, and there are days when she calls me and we talk for an hour and it feels almost like before. And there are days when she goes quiet, and I know she is somewhere in the grief of realizing she was manipulated by someone she had loved. That is its own particular devastation. I don't rush her through it. I just stay near. We are rebuilding, slowly, with a lot of honesty that should have happened years earlier, because I'll say this, I was not perfect in all of it. I had kept things from Lily about her father, not the whole truth, because she was a child and then a teenager, and I told myself I was protecting her. But silence has a way of becoming its own kind of invitation. It leaves space for someone else to fill with whatever story they want to tell. I'm filling the space now, with the truth, all of it, even the parts that are hard to say.
If you are listening to this and you have something buried, a truth you've been protecting someone from, a secret you've been carrying because you thought the weight of it was easier to hold alone, I want to say this gently but directly. The people who love us deserve the chance to know us, really know us, because if we don't give them the real story, we leave the door open for someone else to write it for us. Daniel came back thinking he could rewrite me, rewrite what happened, rewrite who I am in my own daughter's eyes. He was wrong, because I was still here, still standing, and this time, I didn't wait for the smoke to clear. I walked straight into it. Thank you for listening to every word of this. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've been carrying, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what stayed with you. I'll be reading. I always am.